With summer approaching, a lot of people who are applying to medicine have started to think about the UCAT exam. But what exactly is the UCAT exam? Well, in this video, I'm going to go through just a brief overview, not really going through any strategies on how to do well, but just giving those who aren't really sure about the exam a brief overview of what it is and what to expect. I think it's definitely helpful if you're at the start of your journey and you haven't started revision yet, that you really make sure you understand the structure of this exam and kind of what to expect and how it works. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name's Jakra and I'm a first year medical student studying at UCL. And in this video, I just want to go through the basics of the UCAT exam, how it's structured, and just a bit about some of the key dates and also how it's used by some universities. As usual, timestamps will be in the description, and if you find the video useful, then like, comment, subscribe, do all of that, as it really helps the channel out. Now, as of recording this video, which is kind of covering the 2022 UCAT season, the date in which you can start to book the exam will be from the 20th of June onwards from 6 AM. Now, definitely depending on what year you're watching this, double check when the dates for booking the test open up, but I'm pretty sure it's the same every year. Now bear in mind, don't panic, you don't have to book your exam on the 20th of June, it's just when the bookings open. Now if you really want an earlier date, or you have a specific date in mind that you really want to sit your UCAT exam on, maybe because you have other things going on or whatnot, then you definitely want to book as early as you can. Now bear in mind, once you book, you can change the date. I think there's a bit of time where you have to do it in advance, obviously, but you can change the date. But I'd highly recommend, if you're certain you know roughly what date you want to sit it, book it early, because the worst thing that can happen is you kind of leave it too late and then you have much less flexibility about when you can do it, and in the worst case scenario you end up having to compromise and pick a day that's not really convenient. It's also worth noting that the booking deadline is September 22nd, but I assume no one's really going to leave it that late, hopefully, but just in case there's that date, make sure if you're watching this video before the 20th of June, before you've had any chance to book your exam, that you at least register an account on the UCAT website, so that when it does come time to booking your exam, that's one less thing to worry about. Now I'll leave a little screenshot of kind of the key dates, but what you essentially need to know is obviously the date in which you can start booking, and also that tests range from about mid-July to about the end of September. So definitely start thinking about when you want to book your test with those dates in mind. It's quite a big scope, but obviously there are some dates that are a bit more favourable than others. It's also worth noting that in the UK, the UCAT exam will cost you £70, but there are bursaries you can apply for, and if you're lucky, you can maybe have a word with your school and ask them to kind of reimburse the cost. I know my school, I think primarily because we didn't have that many medical applicants, were more than happy to reimburse all the students with the £70 that it cost us. But if your school doesn't have something like that in place, it really doesn't hurt to ask. Now I would recommend booking the test as soon as registration opens. Again, like I said, you'll give yourself the chance to pick a date you actually want, and the general consensus is that you should spend about 4 to 6 weeks of revision time. So with that in mind, definitely pick an appropriate date. The later you leave it, the more things that will kind of pile up and the more compromise you'll likely have to make in terms of which date you want. Now just for a quick overview of the different sections. Now altogether there are 5 sections in the UCAT exam, each of them different from the other. The 5 sections are verbal reasoning, decision making, quantitative reasoning, abstract reasoning, and then the situational judgment test. The first 4 sections that I've mentioned are all marked and given a score between 300 to 900, with 900 being the highest, and 650 being considered kind of like an average score. And the last section, the situational judgment, is given a score from band 1 to band 4, with band 1 being the best and band 4 being the worst. And that's about it for the overview. So now let's kind of focus on the separate sections and go in a bit more detail about each one. It's also worth mentioning that the exam lasts 2 hours, and although that does seem like a lot, I will warn you now, it's a very time constrained exam. It's unlike any exam you've probably sat before. Ironically, the kind of thing you're told once you're preparing or once you're getting closer to the date is that it's an exam that's made not to be finished, and I think as you start prep, that will make a lot more sense to you. Now the first section is verbal reasoning. In this section you have 22 minutes to answer 44 questions, so if you do the maths, that averages out to about 30 seconds per question. This section is all about comprehension, and again you're given given a score between 300 to 900. The general format is that you're given a passage of about 200 to 300 words, so relatively long passage, followed by 4 questions on each passage. So you can imagine the 30 seconds per question is accounting for the time it takes to read it. So really, you have to kind of think of it as 4 questions, and you have 2 minutes to read the text and answer the 4 questions, which again isn't ideal, but with enough practice you'll get better at it. Like I said, this video is just an overview, so we're not really going to go into too much advice on how to do well, but more so just the structure of it. The questions you're given can vary from, identifying information from the text, reaching a conclusion based on a statement they've given you, or even identifying whether a statement is true or false based on the information. It takes a lot of inference and comprehension, so it is definitely one of the more challenging sections. In fact, I think it's consistently ranked as the worst scored or worst kind of performing section out of all 5 every year, and the primary reason for this is it's largely about comprehension, whereas most medical applicants tend to do like the cliche biology, chemistry and maths, or kind of STEM based subjects which don't really encompass much comprehension. So it's definitely one you want to focus on. The next section we're going to talk about is the decision making section. In this section you're given 32 minutes to answer 29 questions, so that averages out to about 66 seconds per question. This section is all about logical thinking and problem solving. It's the type of questions that will really get you to scratch your head at times, and it's one of those sections where practice genuinely makes perfect. There's a lot of thinking, and it tends to be a very kind of mind-numbing section where you're constantly answering questions that aren't super complicated but require a kind of different level of thinking and approach. It's probably got the greatest variety of question types. Questions revolving around, logical puzzles, being given an argument and finding the most appropriate conclusion, and just many more types of questions where really you want to make sure by the time you reach your UCAT, you've had a go at every type of question. The third section is the quantitative reasoning section. In this section, you have 25 minutes to answer 36 questions, so that averages out to about 41 seconds per question. On average, this tends to be the section most students do well in, and the reason for this is the same reason that most students do bad on the verbal reasoning, and that's because this section is largely revolved around maths, and since most medical students, or medical applicants I should say, study A-level maths, that definitely comes in very useful. Now if you're not someone who's doing A-level maths, don't worry, all the maths in this section is at GCSE level, so the maths itself isn't hard, it's more so the time constraints that come with it. In fact, I always think of this section as an odd one, because I guarantee you, if you gave someone a quantitative reasoning section of the UCAT and totally removed the time constraint, majority of students probably could get 100% or close to 100%, because the maths really isn't that difficult. It's just the time constraints that make it a bit harder. So you definitely want to be practicing your quick maths. Another thing to keep in mind for this section is the dreaded UCAT calculator. You are given a calculator for this section, which sounds like a good thing, but the issue is it's not a physical calculator, and anyone who sat the UCAT knows that this calculator requires some practice when it comes to using it. You definitely want to avoid practicing with a physical calculator if you can help it. Section number 4 is the abstract reasoning section. In this section you're given 14 minutes to answer 55 questions, so that averages out to about 15 seconds per question. This section largely tests your ability to pattern spot, that is to be given like a set of shapes and figure out a common rule or pattern amongst all of them. It's probably the worst section when you're starting off the UCAT. One, the time constraints are crazy, but also just because it's such a strange section where finding the patterns at the start just seem impossible, no matter how simple the pattern is. And the common realization most students have when they're starting off is they're doing a question, they cannot spot the pattern, and then they check the answer and they're always thinking like, how did I not see that? And it's a common thing. So if you're starting your UCAT prep and you're finding that the abstract reasoning is an odd section where you just feel like you can't find any patterns, don't worry, it is like that for the majority of students at the start. Now the the rules can vary from being very simple to also being very complicated. I've seen questions where the rule has been something like, oh, all the shapes are black. Whereas I've seen other questions where they kind of have more specific niche rules, like referencing the number of sides and also the number of intersections and all this weird stuff, like just kind of jammed together. So it's definitely worth making sure you get enough exposure to these question types. And last but not least is the situational judgment test. Now for this section, you're given 26 minutes to answer 69 questions. So that averages out to about 22 seconds per question. Now this seems like it would be the most time constrained section considering there's so many questions. But I can guarantee you this is probably the least time constrained section. Most students end up finishing well before the time. And in fact, I think this was the only section that you really have the time to go back and review your answers in a regular pace, really. This section involves you being given like realistic medical scenarios, very ethical based scenarios, where you might be, for example, a medical student or a doctor or whatever, and you're basically given these scenarios and asked, you know, what would you do? Typically the pattern they follow is you're kind of, you know, in hospital and you see something that's not right. Let's say, for example, you overhear two consultants openly talking about a patient and obviously breaking confidentiality, and then they'll ask you, you know, either they'll ask you what you would do in that situation, or they'll give you an action or a response and ask whether or not you think it's appropriate. For example, with the previous scenario I gave, let's assume one of the responses is to do nothing. Obviously, you say that that's very inappropriate, whereas another response might be to go up to the consultants and let them know that everyone can hear them, for example. And obviously that would be a lot more appropriate of a thing to do. So I'm probably not doing a good job at explaining this scenario, but I'll put a question on the screen just to give you a rough idea of what it's like. And that's all 5 sections, so I'm just going to briefly talk about the scoring before I kind of finish off the video. Now, the biggest issue with the UCAT is that there's no black and white way of how it is scored. There's not really a cut-off, so you can't sit there and think, oh, if I get 650, then I'm guaranteed an offer from X, Y, and Z. It doesn't really work like that. Every year, the UCAT cut-off changes, and unis do like publish it after the period, but you can't really use last year's cut-off as written in paper. You have to take it with a grain of salt. Some unis, you know, look at your overall score. Some unis like to focus on specific sections. I know situational judgment is quite a popular one. A lot of unis tend to have a very clear cutoff for that. And there are some unis that don't even really care about the UCAT. They only really use it as a very last resort. Whereas there are some unis, you know, that put a lot of weight on it. The one benefit, however, is that you do get your UCAT score before you send off your applications. And you can definitely use that to your advantage to selectively apply and pick a uni based on your scores. And with that, we have reached the end of the video, so hopefully you found the video useful. Hopefully it's given you a good overview of the UCAT exam, and now you can go into this whole process come June the 20th and really be less in the dark about the whole situation, and you'd be surprised just how much that will help you when it comes to dealing with the stress and knowing how to prepare. But yeah, if you found the video useful, then obviously like, comment, subscribe, do all of that. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.